Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our panel on what does it mean to be a journalist in the age of Wikileaks and Edward Snowden. We have a spectacular panel, of course, for your delectation this evening. We have broad questions to discuss, and this is the biggest one, which is why we're all so interested to get started. At the time of the framing of the Constitution, there seemed to be a distinction between freedom of expression and freedom of the press. The First Amendment to the Constitution explicitly says that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, seeming to create a distinction between ordinary citizens who could express themselves as they liked and the institutionalized journalists who would communicate the information necessary for democracy. But nowadays, as we've seen from the news, anyone with Wi-Fi can call him or herself a journalist. And someone can be a blogger one moment and then an activist the next. And the question of whether someone is a leaker or a whistleblower is especially acute. And the question of whether journalists are even necessary gatekeepers, now that any leaker or whistleblower can post documents in their entirety on the web, complicates the question still further. So we have, what makes this panel so great is we have a combination of the country's best journalists and scholars. Many of them have been professional journalists for a long time, and I think we want to begin just by asking how the role has changed, whether they think their role has changed, and in particular, what they believe their role is as gatekeepers. Do you think, ladies and gentlemen, that you have, as journalists, an obligation to consider the public interest, or perhaps the national security interest, and not to print something that you're given access to? I want to begin with that question, and we've got an awful lot to talk after that. You have their bios. They're all well known to you. We have Howard Fineman of the Huffington Post. We have Heidi Moore of the Guardian, Noah Feldman of Harvard Law School, Gary Rosen of the Wall Street Journal, Ruth Marcus of the Washington Post. So delighted to have all of them here. They're going to begin with very brief opening thoughts, not statements, because this is going to be a conversation, and then we're going to have at it. Ruth.
Oh, good. I get to go first. So in a sense, I think it's not that, it's something that journalists like to discuss, who is a journalist, but it's not all that useful a conversation because it doesn't really matter. You can start to have that debate, but nobody determines who is a journalist in the sense that somebody determines who is a lawyer. Some of the people on this panel are both lawyers and journalists, and as lawyers, we went to law school, we passed the bar, we got licensed to practice law. Thank goodness nobody licenses anybody to practice journalism. That is a good thing, not a bad thing, because if somebody was doing the licensing, it might be the government, and we don't want that. Our Constitution doesn't want that. So, but we still need to grapple with the fact that technology has brought us an enormous set of possibilities of people with access to journalistic means in the form of blogs and the internet in a way that's different, that feels different to us traditional journalists who grew up, some of us, with typewriters, but that also might feel very familiar to the founding fathers when you think about pamphleteers, who, what were they but, old-fashioned bloggers. The thing that I want to really talk about a little bit is what I think of as the really important but fraying social contract between traditional journalists and the government. Because as I have grown up in journalism and watched the Washington Post and other papers grapple in particular with national security affairs, there's been, I think, a balance of equities on both sides. On the one hand, the news organization, a newspaper or a network, has known when it has very explosive information and has taken care with that information, and appropriately so, to go to government officials and say, we have this, what are the consequences? Not should we print it, tell us not to print it, nobody's going to do that. But responsible newspaper editors listen to government officials, and sometimes they agree, sometimes they disagree. Most of the time they split the difference, reach a compromise. When you have the possibilities on the journalistic side of so many different entities bypassing that process, that's a risk. And you also have, similarly, even with existing journalistic enterprises, the risk of knowing that if you don't print it, somebody else will, just shortening the time to go through that process with the government officials and putting pressure on you to share it if it's going to be available nonetheless. On the other part of that social contract is the obligation of the government. We treat them with respect and try to behave, and I think it's really important for us to behave like responsible citizens, to do what we do, which is provide information to people, but to provide it in a way that is least damaging to the national security. But the government has kind of tacitly taken its own responsibility on the other side, which is to treat us with respect. That is, not to do the kind of thing that the Justice Department just did with that very broad-based subpoena for the Associated Press records, where you just ask for this vacuum subpoena for huge swaths of information from huge numbers of telephones for a long period of time, and without giving the news organization the opportunity to know that you're asking for this and to contest it, because there's no chance that the Associated Press was going to take this information and destroy it or something like some criminal. It was in the hands of the telephone company. And so I think when the government fails to uphold its end of the bargain in treating the news organization with respect, which has been the tradition of various privileges and procedures that have been put in place for subpoenaing reporters and subpoenaing their records, then you have this social contract that I think at the moment now is just dangerously frayed, and I'll stop there.
Great, thanks so much. Gary.
Sit around. Well, I think Ruth poses that very well, that there is this important greater question of the role of the media and how it should relate to the government. And the difficulty, of course, is that there are very few bright lines in all of this, so I'm going to try to propose one. And it's going to be this, that the press has public responsibilities, you might even say patriotic responsibilities, and that the best way to see what those are and what their limits are is to consult the law. And so it seems to me that there has to be a kind of deference on the part of the press to these national security issues where the law is clear, the violations of the law involved in these leaks are clear, and that they have an obligation to defer to the government and to the asserted claims of the government in these situations. Now, I think there are exceptions, and that the press must take it upon itself sometimes to push those limits and to challenge the government and see if the government wants to pursue it. But I think in these cases, and I would point back even farther to these cases involving the New York Times and the original NSA case, and then, of course, the case with SWIFT, which was the financial transactions issue, that the press needs to take more seriously the fact that in publishing these classified operational details about national security programs, they are breaking the law. They are breaking the Communications Intelligence Act. They are violating the Espionage Act, and the members of the press are citizens of this country as well, and they are obliged to comply with American law. So that seems to me a clear line, and I don't think it should involve some basic compromise of our traditions. There shouldn't be prior restraint. The federal marshals shouldn't accompany the people from the Justice Department and DOD when they have these meetings with the editors. The editors have to be free to publish these details, but if in its discretion the Justice Department should decide that it needs to make an example then I think the press should be held accountable for these clear violations of black-letter American law.
Wow.
Applause.
Wow.
In the interest of conversation, I want to ask you to
I'm going to weigh in exactly.
weigh in. And after all, journalists have not traditionally been prosecuted under the
That's right.
Espionage Act, and yet we learned that the Justice Department was considering prosecution against James Rosen, a journalist, as well as Julian Assange, who might or might not be considered a journalist. So maybe you could respond to Gary.
Absolutely. So first of all, I want to say I'm very grateful to Ruth for framing this in terms of it being a contract, because it's not a written contract. It's an imaginary contract. Those are the best kind. And I'm also very grateful to Gary for sharply framing the issue in terms of following the law, because since you're a journalist and you would actually be subject to those laws,
Absolutely.
and I'm a law professor who occasionally dabbles as a journalist, it's good for me to be able to say that respect for the law is a disaster in this situation. So we want some disagreement here.
Good.
Let me try to explain why I think that our own institutions, our own constitutional institutions, have never adopted the view that Gary just argued for. So first, a historical note. The contract that Ruth is talking about took a long time to develop. The Constitution mentions the press to say that it is free, but the original press in the United States, as you probably all know, was scurrilous and nasty and verged on libel with every word that it printed. It was not institutionalized in the way that we have come to think of it as being institutionalized. That really took place over the course of the 20th century, and not even at the beginning of the 20th century, when the yellow journalism was still, to a very significant extent, untrammeled and unconstrained by ordinary norms. But with the realm of professionalized journalism, which emerged around a little bit later than some of the other professions, like law or medicine, or accounting for that matter, we got a kind of gradual process whereby journalists came to believe, and the government came to act, as though they would act responsibly. Now, what did responsibly mean? If it had simply meant following the law, I don't think we would have imagined there to be an independent professional responsibility on the part of the journalists. Right? If I'm constrained by law, then the law tells me what to do. I don't need a profession, and I don't need norms to tell me what to do. And in many of the most significant cases that we think of as important, the Pentagon Papers case, just to take an archetypal example, it was against the law to publish the papers because they were classified. There has been a practice developed by the Department of Justice in its discretion, but I would say discretion informed by what it takes to be constitutional obligations, that it would prosecute the leakers even if they were whistleblowers. And Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, was prosecuted. The prosecution broke down only because the Nixon administration was so worried about discrediting him that they had broken into his psychiatrist's office and got information that then so tainted the possibility for a trial that they couldn't go forward. But they were going to prosecute him, and to his credit, and this differentiates him from Julian Assange, and possibly we don't know yet from Snowden, he said he was willing to be prosecuted. But there was no question of prosecuting the Washington Post. Ditto for many of the Watergate papers. And the reason for that was that the law as written, which absolutely would hold the journalists to, and would probably, well, I don't want to say probably, which if put in the courts might produce a result. It's an open question, whether it would produce a result that said, well, national security has been violated here and there shall be some kind of liability. The Department of Justice has believed that it does not apply. Now, last point on this. 50 states, but not the federal government, I think it's 50 now, have journalist shield laws that say that in the same way that if you say something to your priest under the seal of confession, he can't be, or I guess it's always he if it's a Catholic seal of confession. I was about to say he or she. He can't be subpoenaed to speak about that. It's not restricted under the law to Catholic priests, but under other circumstances too. There are special privileges that are afforded. And lawyers, of course, since lawyers write the law, lawyers always write in a privilege for themselves, so there's a lawyer's privilege as well. 50 states think that journalists are the same as priests and lawyers. They can't be made to testify. The federal government does not agree. And so big-time cases, like most recently the Judy Miller case, but other cases that we've talked about, have arisen where the journalists are not being prosecuted for a crime, but they're told they have to reveal their sources, and that if they don't reveal their sources, they'll go to prison, or rather jail. And they do, in fact, go to jail in some cases. Judy Miller's case is a special one, where I think arguably she wanted to go to jail. But only for a short time. But the long and the short of it is that our system does sometimes punish journalists, but in that case, it's punishment as a form of coercion. Right? The idea is actually we're going to lock you up until you talk, at which point you'll be free to go. So my own view is it would be a mistake, just to close my own thought, it would be a mistake to rely on the law as written because it's crazy. And it's crazy in part because what is classified goes enormously far. And for those of you who have had opportunities to work in government, you'll see that if you write a memo or a cable in the State Department and you don't classify it, no one will read it. You must classify. And you ought to classify to the highest level that you are authorized to classify, just in order to say, it's like putting the little red flag on your email. Please read this email. Or the subject matter, please read, which always cracks me up. That's what classification is. And it means that, and of course it's not true in every case, but it means there's wild overclassification. And just to close with Snowden, take the example of that part of his material that has been disclosed. And there's a lot more that hasn't been. Right? Did it have to be confidential that the United States government collected metadata on every phone call made in the United States? I'm not sure for national security reasons it had to be. You don't think Osama bin Laden knows that someone's listening to his calls or trying to track his calls? I mean, this is a known fact. And if you ask then why must it have been secret, there's really only one answer. It was secret because if we knew about it, we'd be upset about it. That's a bad reason for something to be secret in a democracy.
This is either a mixed or an easy crowd because you're applauding for both sides.
They're enthusiasts.
Right. All right, we've heard an excellent case for journalists being treated no differently than ordinary citizens when it comes to the law. We've heard an equally eloquent case for the special status of journalists. You write for The Guardian, Heidi, and of course Glenn Greenwald worked with you in his important disclosures. Greenwald previously had presented himself as an activist and a blogger rather than a journalist who wouldn't be edited and insisted on publishing directly. In this case, he decided to work in conjunction with you and to work with your editors. Tell us what sort of judgments were made. Did you consider the public interest in deciding to publish some stuff and not others? And to what degree was he acting as a traditional journalist and working with you?
Absolutely. I should clarify that I did not work directly with Glenn, but our editors did. And obviously our newsroom is small in the United States. It's 57 people and it is a US LLC. But obviously word travels fast. So Glenn, I have to say I'm baffled and perplexed by this idea that Glenn is a blogger and not a journalist for several reasons. Number one, he's a columnist. He has an opinion column. Part of it is published to a blog, but in the tradition of opinion columnists, he's very much in the model of a Nicholas Kristof or even a Maureen Dowd. It is the tradition of columnists to choose a topic and to reveal insights about it, which obviously has an activist effect, but it's something that we accept very clearly when it's printed on newsprint, and somehow when it goes on the internet, everything goes pear-shaped, and no one knows which way's up. And I find that baffling and not particularly helpful, to tell you the truth. So Glenn is an opinion columnist, and he has been following up on issues of freedom, of government surveillance, of flaws in the Obama administration for some time, and that's why Edward Snowden said that he came to him. I think, to answer your question, the role of a journalist is to represent the world as it is. It is not to represent an official account of the world. It is not to represent what a spokesperson told you. It is not to represent what may be convenient. It is to represent the world as it is. It is the first draft of history. And as such, there is a duty to tell the truth. And so very much to Gary's point about the law, there are a lot of laws that are bad laws, and it is the practice of the United States to examine and to challenge our laws. They are not written on stone. They are not passed down, from a man wearing robes who's just spoken to a burning bush. They are the way that we rule the country. And think that in the 1950s in the South, if you followed the rules of segregation, you would have been a law-abiding citizen. And those laws were not correct. And so the purpose of what Glenn did and what Edward Snowden has said he did, and again, I haven't spoken to Edward Snowden, is to challenge laws that they feel are not evenly applied, that are not openly applied, and that defy the freedom of the United States as we know it and as we accept it as a democratic being. And that's what has informed our coverage. Now, to do that, obviously, you have to work with the truth. So, the idea of activism is not particularly useful here. What we had was a group of slides that described a certain truth, but not all of it. No one has pretended that they know what the slides mean. And our process has been to take the slides, go to various intelligence agencies, ask them what they mean, ask them if there's an impact on national security, a specific impact on national security. And slowly, this has led to more revelations. But as other people have said, Edward Snowden did not give all the slides to us or to the Washington Post. We did not publish all of the few slides that he gave us. And so there's a very careful exercise of the power of information here. And it is being done purely to force the government to justify its own actions. And so the idea of the Espionage Act or any of that being invoked is somewhat absurd, if you ask me personally, not speaking for The Guardian, because we are, as journalists, we are the recipients of leaks all the time from government officials. It is our job to accept these leaks. And then somehow, when it is not approved by a public relations spokesperson, it's an evil leak, and we are spies, and we are against America, and we hate freedom. And it's not quite that way. America is designed to be questioned. And if it cannot bear the scrutiny, then what kind of country do we have?
I think this is a good sign. So Howard, you've got a tough act to follow because you're going to get the applause as well. But Heidi,
The applause
I plan to get
and
none.
it's getting louder with each speaker too, which is a great thing. Heidi described Glenn Greenwald as an opinion columnist. Others have said he was too close to his source. He was not just expressing an opinion, but was actively talking to Edward Snowden before Snowden actually downloaded the material. Is there a sense in which a reporter needs some distance from his source, that he should not both collude to acquire the information or try to help the source escape prosecution after the fact? Is that consistent with your vision of the traditional role of the journalist? And what's your thoughts on Greenwald and journalism?
Okay, well, the phrase traditional role of the journalist has kind of been blown up. Everybody loves the word disrupt. That's like the word of the decade. Let's disrupt everything. The traditional world of the journalist has been disrupted big time. So it's hard to say anything about tactics. What matters is what truths that are verifiable are reported. Let me back up for a minute to tell you what my vision of all this is. What's special about this country, what is unique about it, was that it was the first society ever put together where information wasn't controlled from the top down. There was no divine right of kings. There was no ultimate source of authority in the political world. We separated the political world from the religious world, at least in theory. The First Amendment, I think it's a little too fine to try to separate free speech in the press, because freedom of assembly is also in there and so forth. I think what the founders were talking about was something I call the velocity of information. Because of the First Amendment, because of the way we were founded, this is the most creative and free society in the history of the planet, at least in theory, not always in fact, but at least in theory. And in that framework, I think anybody can be a journalist. I personally am not all that impressed with shield laws. I traveled long ago in the old Soviet Union when it still existed. The Soviet Union had the most rigorous standards for saying who was a journalist, because there was an inverse relationship between the rigorousness of their standards and the freedom of the society. Anybody can be a journalist, especially today, because we live in a crowdsourced, socially enabled world. A guy who used to be at the used to be an editor to the Huffington Post, and before that at the New York Times, said that when he was at the New York Times, the ideal was that when you were a reporter at the New York Times and you wrote a story, it was the end of the conversation. And at the Huffington Post, when you write a story, it's the beginning of the conversation. And that's because Arianna Huffington, my Maximum Leader's fundamental insight, was to combine a social media site with a news gathering site. Journalists today have to learn how to deal with the crowd. They have to understand big data, crowdsourcing, the fact that the whole planet is turning into one journalistic consciousness, if you will. And we can't write anybody out of that equation, especially in the United States. So that's my big picture. On the question of what's legal and what's not, and when the journalist should dare to defy the government and the law, here's my standard. We're heading into a society where the government either does know or is going to know everything about your life, and probably already does to a large extent. And with the rise of computing power, we're seeing a situation where all of the information about everybody's life on the planet is going to be more comprehensively contained on ever smaller and faster computers. It's all going to be out there. And even as the government knows more about you, you know less about the government. And anybody who purports to be a journalist, who is going to help me as a citizen keep the velocity of information flowing by telling me what the government knows about me, I'm going to be for. So I agree with you that there are laws. The ones I'm willing to challenge are the ones that relate to the process of speech, if you see what I'm saying here. That's the way I would distinguish it. Missile sites, attack, poised, the Times thing, frankly, on that, I have problems with that. But I don't really have problems, even though Snowden may be a loathsome figure. The fact that he was going after the fundamental issue of free speech and what the government knows about you and what you know about the government predisposes me, despite his methods, to support him. End of speech.
Good. We're whatever, 5-0 on the applause, which is good. What I heard in this first round of very interesting conversation was some skepticism about the idea of a traditional journalist, although we had some good disagreement about whether journalists should be prosecuted. I did not hear a lot of support for the ideal of the journalist as a weigher of information, as providing context, the idea that you shouldn't get too close to sources, that there's some things that shouldn't be printed, because in this age of WikiLeaks and digital downloads, if Greenwald hadn't printed Snowden's stuff, then he could have posted it directly to the web himself. So just as we finish up this round, does anyone want to stand up for the role of the filtering mechanism?
Oh, should we go back around?
We don't have to
Ruth.
go in
No,
order,
we
'cause
shouldn't
it's gotta
go
be
back
a
around.
conversation, but you raise your hand first. So.
But I do think that there are things that shouldn't be reported. But that decision has to be up to the news organization, or in the modern world, the individual with a Gmail account to make that responsible decision. Because the only thing worse than a world in which either news organizations or people who are acting in a journalistic capacity print things that are potentially damaging to the national interest is a world in which they don't print things that are potentially damaging to the national interest for fear of being prosecuted. So I thought, Noah, you made a brilliant retort to Gary's remarks, but I think by arguing about overclassification, you sort of understated the case, because when we report classified information, the value of our reporting classified information isn't that we're reporting the information that shouldn't be classified. It is very often that we're reporting information that may properly be classified, but also may be very critical for us as citizens to know. If you think about the totality of the reporting on things like drones and drone policy, about all of the post 9/11 surveillance techniques, I think it's been very, very important for the country to know about it. I think whatever you think of Snowden, I think that the conversation we're having as a country now on that subject has been very healthy, and the notion that newspapers should stop and think about, or news organizations should stop and think about whether they should report and how they should report and what details they should report, because they have responsibilities as citizens, not because they are afraid of being prosecuted. Because I think it's, you mentioned at the start, Jeff, that the Justice Department had considered prosecuting yet another Rosen, right? You
There are a
guys
lot of
are
us here, yes.
everywhere.
I was once at a dinner of 6 of us, all of whom were unrelated, but
That's why I was at
we were all under threat of
I was at a
prosecution.
Klein thing like that once. I guess I was an honorary Klein or something. But I think that you slightly misstated it, if I may, because I don't think they ever really seriously considered prosecuting Rosen. They talked about him as a potential aider and abettor, but that was a very, in an affidavit, but that is a very large step from considering prosecuting him. I cannot imagine in this world that we're going to end up living in your world where that could happen.
Just on that, an FBI agent in an affidavit said that he could be prosecuted, and now, of course, there's, as we know in the famous exchange between David Gregory and Glenn Greenwald, Gregory said to Greenwald, "Why shouldn't you be prosecuted?" Provoking a vigorous response from Greenwald. What do you think of Gregory's suggestion? And Gary, you're the person to ask this.
Yeah.
What do you think of Gregory's suggestion that Greenwald should be prosecuted?
I think, on its face, knowing what we do now about how all of this unfolded, that there's a decent case for Greenwald and the people at Wikileaks being charged with criminal conspiracy in joining with Snowden in a very deliberate fashion to penetrate Booz Allen with the idea of acquiring reams and reams and reams of national security intelligence to release out to the world. Because it seems clear now, and again, I think this is based on Washington Post reporting, that Snowden was in touch with Greenwald and Wikileaks.
WikiLeaks is a news site. I think that's the next
He was in
brand.
touch with these organizations before he took the job with Booz Allen. So it seems like the job was meant to give him access to these things that he was going to acquire for them. But let me now agree with Ruth and with Noah.
After we were
and
so
to qualify,
mean to you.
no,
But
but to,
I'm going to disagree again.
no, because I've got to, because I only had 2 or 3 minutes for that opening statement, which was outrageous and very assertive and unqualified. But so let me
Not
say this:
imposed by your moderator.
I think Ruth is right that the discretion has to be with the journalist, and Noah is right that there's this wild overclassification in government. And so what the editors and reporters have to say to themselves is, in looking at classified material that they want to leak out, is it material that in some way really does hurt national security in some essential way? Or is it just something that in a matter-of-fact way has been classified? And I think in these cases where what's being leaked is operational information about programs that are ongoing, that they really owe a kind of deference to the people who have the responsibility for following through on those laws. And they don't have to comply, as the New York Times did not, and as we know from sort of the narratives that have emerged with those requests, but they have to understand that in making that decision, they are, in a way, rolling the dice. And they are saying, we are knowingly violating these laws, and we will accept the consequences because we think what we're doing serves the public good enough to counterweigh those arguments.
Except
can I reply to that,
if they're about
actually?
the unconstitutional surveillance of the American
No,
people.
and if there's a question of legality, but I don't think anyone, I don't think Snowden, I don't think Greenwald has said that the programs they revealed are illegal.
Oh,
Yeah,
Greenwald
yes,
certainly
yeah.
has said
Yeah.
that they violate the Fourth Amendment and the...
No, but okay.
They violate the statute.
Unconstitutional.
There are
But
also
the Fourth
26
Amendment.
senators. There are also
And
26
Unconstitutional.
congressmen who doubt whether it's legal.
But
Can I reply?
Heidi, you wanted to respond
Yeah.
to Gary.
Yeah, well, first of all, there are 26 congressmen who are questioning whether it is legal, and that is part of opening the conversation, which is part of the process of journalism. Also, just in response to the idea of national security, as I said, our editors went to each of these intelligence agencies and asked them, do you have a specific national security concern? We told them what we were going to publish. We were very clear, very upfront. We had a very open contract with them. And they didn't come back with anything. And so to the idea of methods, while that sounds incredibly fancy and like something out of a John le Carre novel, as Howard said, if you're a terrorist, chances are you have burner phones and you're not using Gmail, you're not on Twitter, right? You're not a particularly
Right.
active Facebook user. So, all of these ideas that somehow,
All of those-
were compromised.
The Tsarnaevs were all of those things, and they were terrorists. So just to make a small point on the other side.
Right, but the idea that there is, that something has been violated by any of these slides in terms of specific methods of either, government process or of intelligence tradecraft is completely unsupported.
The problem here is that the technology has outrun our current interpretations of the Constitution, it seems to me. I think the possibilities, again, I harp on this surveillance business because I think it's important, because I think what it can do is freeze the ability of people to speak freely. And that is my touchstone for everything. And if you think that the government, I don't care, I know kids are on Facebook all the time and so forth, but if you look at the polls, even though they live their lives publicly, and in theory they don't care if everything is public, they want to write their own narrative of their life. They don't want the government writing a secret narrative of their life that the government can spring on them at any time. And having seen totalitarian societies, having traveled in them over the years, what I saw in the old Soviet Union, where people were afraid to speak because they didn't know the extent to which the government really knew everything about their lives. That is a dagger aimed at the heart of what the American experience is about. And so when the Fourth Amendment talked about the right of people to be secure in their person and their papers and so forth, that has to be extended. That notion has to be extended further than it currently has, in my view, in order for us to be the society we need to be. And one of the roles of journalism that's justified in my mind to take chances, to risk going to jail, is over just that kind of thing. One other point about the expertise of journalism. What's the role of what's the role of editing the crowd, as I like to refer to it? Who edits the crowd? In a crowdsourced world, who edits the crowd? We have an even deeper need for deeply knowledgeable, scientifically thinking people to suss out the data that's closest to the truth. So I think one of the ironic results of this new crowdsourcing era is going to be to create a new generation of extremely sophisticated people who call themselves journalists, who can try to take the power of crowdsourcing and big data and what Julian Assange and these others are doing, and harnessing it for the good. And that's, I know at Columbia Journalism School, which I attended, and which Nick Lemon was the dean of for 10 years, he was making a big effort to expand the program. When I went to Columbia, the conceit of it was that it was like plumbing school with a typewriter. It was 9 months of learning how to write a lead, and it was almost anti-intellectual in its orientation. What Nick, who's a very smart guy, you may know from the New Yorker and so on, did was to say, no, we're going to expand the program. We're going to make everybody take deep courses in biotechnology or cryptology or whatever, so they can try to deal with the explosion of knowledge that we're dealing with. And so the old model of the reporter is the old English model, really. It goes back to England in the 18th century, of the sort of gentleman journalist who doesn't really know much about anything, but knows how to write a lead. All that's going to have to change in this new era, in my view. So it's many different topics, but sorry.
Well, it was a great point about how uncertainty about whether we're being surveilled can make us less secure in our persons, houses, papers, and effects. I thought that was a
And in
strong
our ability, and our desire to speak freely.
amendment point, and strong connections with free speech too. Noah, can you wrap up this thread on whether journalists have public responsibilities, and even if Greenwald, if you don't think, as you've argued powerfully, Greenwald and other journalists should not be prosecuted, should we be troubled by the lack of boundaries by a journalist talking with or conspiring with a source in
Yeah.
advance and not maintaining any distance or boundaries from the source that journalists used to have.
I think we should be very worried about it, and it's because of the reason that follows. Ruth, you said you can't really imagine the prosecution of journalists. I can, and I'll tell you why. It's because in a world where the journalistic institutions did what The Guardian did and said, well, we're not going to publish this until we've talked and asked whether there is a serious national security threat, and we'll exercise judgment. In that world, there's a kind of trade-off that Ruth was talking about earlier, and you could say, well, we're not going to prosecute them, and in fact, we're right not to prosecute them. In a world where that collapses, where the distinction between a journalist and a non-journalist collapses, and where, 10 years from now, the next Snowden or Glenn Greenwald doesn't think that they need, for credibility purposes, to run it through The Guardian or The Washington Post, but just say, we're going to post it. And by the way, that's close to Julian Assange's position. I mean, he also worked with newspapers, but then they posted a lot of it on their own. In that world, the government is not going to tolerate the assault on its capacity to keep secrets. It just won't happen. The government is too powerful to tolerate that. And it will not think, well, it's all right, we can manage it because we can talk to them. And given that, it will prosecute those people, and it will then prosecute journalists, because there will no longer be this firm distinction. We're in a transitional moment now, I think. And if the journalistic institutions can sustain their credibility by continuing to engage in this form of judgment and hold the line, then I think we could continue to have something like what we have now, where I can say, don't prosecute the journalists. But if the journalistic institutions can't hold the line, and if we do enter a world where everybody just posts things and secrets begin to disappear, we will see prosecution not just of individuals, but I think we will see prosecution of the journalistic institutions, and it will succeed in the courts.
Yeah, because they'll use the attack on the renegades to go after the establishment.
So the responsibility is as important as it could possibly be.
I agree, and the remorseless logic of security, combined with bureaucracy, combined with the technology that we now have, makes the ability of the government to not only to know everything, but to at least try to keep secrets that much more urgent for them.
But for anyone else, does this raise some issues? I mean, thinking about the enormous resources of a government that can track all of its citizens, and not only track them, but keep their phone metadata, know about their Skype chats, their Gmail. Think about the expense and the power that you need to have in order to maintain that kind of infrastructure. And for an entity that large to turn all of its resources against a single person or a group of people for revealing something that presumably is true, we're not talking about false things, but that things that are true, do we feel that that's a responsible use of the power of the US government?
This introduces
different
powerful. This
question.
has been an excellent discussion
That's a different question.
on the need for boundaries in journalism, and only by maintaining them, Noah suggests, can we maintain the distinction that allows leakers but not journalists to be prosecuted. I want to ask now about leakers and about Snowden. So the Obama administration has launched 6 leak prosecutions so far, more than all previous administrations combined. There had been only 3 since the Espionage Act was passed in 1917. And yet, was that a little bit of applause in there? It is a bipartisan crowd here in Aspen, but it was a cough. Snowden, though, is a unique case. If recent allegations are to be true, unlike Daniel Ellsberg, who Noah suggested thought he was acting in the public interest, was willing to take the consequences of prosecution, and also wanted to foment political change, Snowden, according to the latest reports, took the job with the government with the intent and purpose of disclosing the information, and has refused to accept prosecution. Snowden, whistleblower or traitor is the usual dichotomy. That's too stark, but I do want to ask the group whether you think that Snowden deserves less sympathy than other leakers like Thomas Drake, for example, who seemed to have been motivated more by a desire to expose information than to get the job with the intent of gaining publicity for themselves.
When I must say, and I gave a semi-impassioned defense of him earlier, but let me say that if it's true, as I think he himself has said, right, that he went in to Booz Allen with the intent to do that, then he's got to be prosecuted. And when they catch him, he's got to be prosecuted for that.
But hadn't, just out of curiosity,
He
so
had, to me,
hadn't he been in the NSA previously? I'm
Yeah.
not sure I understand what he's saying, but isn't he saying, I knew this was happening from my prior job. I was outraged. So then I went into the private sector so that I would actually be able
No, but that's
to...
a form, to me, that's...
I'm just
a-
asking. I'm not
okay,
saying.
To
I'm
me,
asking if that's
to
what
me,
he's
that's
saying.
a form of trespass. I mean, I don't know what you would call it. It's a form of trespass. It's a form of fraud. It's not journalism as I understand it. And, you know, I've been a reporter for 40 years, and I've done my share of things that I'm not proud of. I'm not going to talk about because Eric Cantor's here. But the rule of thumb, and it's journalistic, but it's also humanistic or moral. You know, if you've ever have a feeling in the pit of your stomach that you're doing something that doesn't feel quite right, that you're trespassing, that you're committing a fraud of some kind. I know I would have felt that way if I applied for that job,
Right.
specifically knowing that was my intent. To me, that's not a journalist in action. That part of it.
Well,
Snowden's a leaker, not a
he's
journalist.
the
Yeah.
leaker, not the journalist, and it seems to me
Right.
that, look, he could have been at the NSA and gotten this information at the NSA, not having gone in under false pretenses, but gotten himself worked up and outraged and believing it really needed to be exposed. Or he could have gone into Booz Allen with those same intentions. It doesn't seem to me that the intention sneaking in there
disagree.
makes it all that much worse.
I disagree.
It
I
is
disagree.
either way. What I'm saying is either way, it is a violation. And while I'm not happy with me being prosecuted for, or any of my colleagues being prosecuted for reporting responsibly on his disclosures, if the government is in a situation where it knows the leaker and the leaker has clearly damaged the national security and violated the law, I have no problem with the prosecution in that circumstance. I would argue that for the most part, leak investigations come up empty, empty, empty. You look at the AP investigation. They said they interviewed 550 people. After having interviewed 550 people, they didn't have their answer because at least one of those 550 people lied. So then they go and they get all the phone records. So right, you get corroborating evidence that might suggest that A talked to B and A leaked to B. Well, A has already lied about it, and B isn't going to tell you about it, and you're not going to get yourself in a Judy Miller situation and tell B that he needs to go to jail to protect his source, because that never ends up actually benefiting anybody. And so most of these leak investigations, the government may believe it has to do them in order to send a signal, but they almost always end up empty-handed and unproductive.
And indeed, it was the leak investigations of Drake and others that inspired Snowden to engage in his activities. Just because we've had 2 cases for the prosecution of Snowden, no, assuming the facts are as you say, we're not sure, and he took the CIA job because he was appalled by what happened at the NSA, do you think Snowden should be prosecuted as a leaker?
Only if the government is also prosecuting people whose leaks are quasi-sanctioned. So that may be what's about to happen. We may be shifting to a world where there's rumors of, reports of investigation of a very senior general for leaking information connected to national security, while an acting serving general in a national security position. In a world where you're going to consistently prosecute everybody who does this, yes, I don't think there's anything wrong with prosecuting Snowden. In fact, it's desirable. The question is the government going to do it consistently? And if it does do it consistently, we're going to be in a very changed environment where officials who are accustomed to thinking that they're in a, presumably this general, if he did leak, thought he was in a position of sufficient responsibility that he was the decision maker, right? He presumably believed that in the same way that I presume the president believes that, and the people who are working around the president believe when they leak things that are confidential. And in a world where you can't do that anymore, the information sources are going to decline.
Well,
that may be a world that the government wants.
That's not going to happen. Obviously, that's not going to happen. I mean,
Well, then they should
people would say
prosecute.
that the White House leaked information about the raid on Osama bin Laden that was secret.
And I think the key to this not turning into something very different from our experience of the last several decades, where leaks are a routine part of coverage in Washington, where in a way it's condoned in a sort of winking way by administrations and by reporters. The way this doesn't become some sort of across-the-board crackdown is through the exercise of discretion, not only by reporters and editors, but by people in the government. And in a way, using that discretion is how we negotiate the fact that we have rampant overclassification in government, and only certain things are so crucial that they really have to be protected that way. And on the other hand, we have a press which has lots of competitive pressures, wants to be first with stories, wants to feel like it's furthering stories, and will have things dumped in its lap that it will have to ask itself in some way, balancing these concerns. Is it worth the public's knowing to reveal these things that we are, in some sense, knowingly breaking the law to reveal? And I would say that Noah's idea that by emphasizing the ways that editors and journalists exercise their discretion is a way to hold these boundaries, I think those boundaries are not going to hold. That what we're seeing is that every individual is going to become a self-styled publisher and journalist. And so here's the question for you. Let's say Edward Snowden did not take all of this information, but walked out, got a web designer, and said, here are the Ed Snowden Times. And I'm not just releasing these 4 innocuous slides, which I agree with you, don't tell you anything that you didn't know already, right? I'd be a little disappointed if the government weren't doing all the things described in those slides.
Well, I didn't.
He walked out with 4 portable computers containing we don't know what. And so if he had walked out and downloaded the contents of those computers onto the Ed Snowden Times and said, here I am, the combined leaker, whistleblower, publisher, journalist, exercising my First Amendment rights, do we say that's in keeping with our robust tradition?
And
Well,
that's what
I
Bradley Manning and Julian
Yeah.
Assange did. I mean, that's
Yeah.
not a hypothetical. That is what they did.
Okay, but is that okay?
No.
Okay.
I think it's helpful to point out that Edward Snowden himself has said that he expects to be prosecuted. His main concern is whether he'll get a fair trial, which I think is a fair concern considering what people have seen Bradley Manning go through. So he does expect it. He walked into it, as our editor Janine Gibson and Alan Rusbridger have said, he walked into it knowing what he was getting into as much as you can if you're 29 years old and have lived your life in the intelligence world. So he knows what's coming. He just wants a fair trial.
Just trying to get out of the Moscow airport.
Which lesser men with less information have not accomplished.
And that may be punishment enough.
Right. Exactly. And then also, I hear so much about the Moscow airport. Anyway, very much
several,
to Jeff's point about whether he's sympathetic, I think that there is a moralistic streak in America where we expect our leakers and our sources to be holy men of some kind, to be pure and unconflicted. And I think in all of our experiences as journalists, of the journalists on this panel, that is not the case. Often, sources can be people who are dissatisfied with the system, who are dissenters, who may have some petty axe to grind. Never forget that, Watergate was about, some petty bureaucratic dust-up and basically led to the downfall of an administration. You can't always vouch for the intentions of sources, and although it's a good thought exercise, what's more important is, does it contribute anything to the truth? And in the case of certainly this story, I think we can argue that it does, and it also contributes to the national conversation.
But too, it would have been even more truer in a more comprehensive sense if every single thing he had taken out on those computers was made public. That is all true. But it's a truth that is deeply damaging to protecting the legitimate interest of the United States.
But in this case, we're talking about, a sort of, I would say responsible, not speaking for anybody else, but, a very strategic release of information, and we're working with the hypothetical that it wasn't. And so I'm not sure that that really describes the situation. A lot of people have devoted their effort and their experience to determining what can be published. And unfortunately, the government, which has not been upfront about this, as we saw with James Clapper's testimony, has not been very helpful in describing the situation as it is. And so can the Guardian do it alone? No. Can the Washington Post do it alone? No. What we'd like to see is more of the press pitching in and saying, here is something that is true and that is deep and that we should devote our resources to as a group.
I mean, but
I'm
just
hearing,
imagine.
I'm hearing a distinction here, which is helpful, between information and knowledge. So we've heard a denunciation of document dumps on the ground that more information doesn't necessarily lead to the truth. It may lead to people being judged out of context, to misinformation, to genuinely secret sources being revealed and to lives being harmed. So I think there does seem to be some idea that whether it's journalists or other filtering mechanisms, in order to achieve knowledge that's necessary for democracy, we need some limits on information. Howard raised a point about political inconsistency, and I wonder, maybe this is to Heidi, just on behalf of The Guardian, is it inconsistent for Glenn Greenwald and his supporters who called for the leak prosecution of Scooter Libby, for example, to oppose a leak prosecution for Snowden?
I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure that I'm actually, it's an excellent question. I'm not sure that I'm in a position to answer it because I don't speak for Glenn. So you would have to ask Glenn how he resolves those two different thoughts. But I think the fact that you're posing the question is very relevant.
I don't think Scooter Libby should have been prosecuted, I'll just say. I mean,
So do you want to take the position that leak prosecutions in general should be used much more sparingly than they are?
absolutely,
now?
absolutely.
Yeah. So I've done, in my rigorous job as a moderator, I've just gotten the sign that we've run out of time. But it's impossible in a panel about the free exchange of ideas to have at least, not to have at least one question. So I think let me invite at least a question from the audience, man in the front row.
When you talked about James Rosen, and then Ruth
Hold on.
mentioned it.
Take this so the other people can hear.
When you mentioned James Rosen, and then later Ruth brought it up again, I find that treatment of James Rosen outrageous, because to go in and get an affidavit saying that he was aiding and abetting, and then go before Congress and take an oath that you're going to tell the whole truth. And this is Eric Holder, supposedly our highest enforcer of justice. I find that extremely troubling. So I just wonder if you find it as troubling, because I was throwing things at my television said, well, he was testifying. And I wondered if anybody was as outraged as I was.
I think we might find a lot of outrage. Let me flip it and ask, is anyone not outraged and think it was appropriate, at least for the FBI agent to entertain the possibility that he might have been liable for prosecution? And I'll throw that to Gary, obviously.
He's my uncle, so no.
Oh.
Yeah. No, he's not my uncle. He's not my uncle. He's not my uncle.
Rosen solidarity.
He's not my uncle.
Good. Ladies and gentlemen, we have not had consensus, but we have had enlightenment on this fascinating question. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Great job.
Thank you.